Okay, Greg, if you've got a problem with me putting this out there this way, uh, just send me an email. There's where you've sent me an email, and let me know. But I think it's important to get this out there on my show, and this is how I do things. So I'm going to start it running in text to voice and show your page here where you've got this story. I have been trying to articulate the racist side of what's going on in Venezuela for a long time, and of course you do it so well. I mean, you're a professional. I don't even pretend to be a professional. I got about 18 people on my YouTube, so don't get too excited. It's not gonna like make you famous or anything. But here it goes. Just for my sake and for my viewers' sake, I want them to see this.
In Venezuela, white supremacy is a key to Trump's coup. February 8, 2019. Greg Palast for Truth Out. On January 23, right after the phone call from Donald Trump, Juan Guaido, former Speaker of Venezuela's National Assembly, declared himself president. No voting. When you have official recognition from the Donald, who needs elections? Say what? I can explain what's going on in Venezuela in 3 photos. First, we have Juan Guaido, self-proclaimed and Trump-proclaimed president of the nation, with his wife and child, the photo prominently placed in the New York Times. Next, the class photo of Guaido's party members in the National Assembly, white as snow, especially when compared to their political opposites. In the third photo, the Congress members who support the elected President Nicolas Maduro. The Maduro supporters are nearly all of a darker hue. This is the story of Venezuela in black and white, the story not told in the New York Times nor the rest of our establishment media. This year's so-called popular uprising is, at its heart, a furious backlash of the wider and wealthier Venezuelans against their replacement by the larger mestizo mixed-race core. For centuries of white supremacy in Venezuela by those who identified their ancestors as European came to an end with the 1998 election of Hugo Chavez, who won with the overwhelming support of the mestizo majority. This turn away from white supremacy continues under Maduro, Chavez's chosen successor. In my interviews with Chavez for BBC beginning in 2002, he talked with humor about the fury of the white ruling class finding itself displaced by dark-skinned man who was so visibly Negro Indio, a label he wore loudly and proudly. Why did the poor love Chavez? And love is not too strong a word, as even the U.S. CIA surprisingly honest fact book states. Social investment in Venezuela during the Chavez administration reduced poverty from nearly 50% in 1999 to about 27% in 2011, increased school enrollment, substantially decreased infant and child mortality, and improved access to potable water and sanitation through social investment. What should be added is that, even more than the USA, race and poverty are linked. But just as Maduro took office in 2013, the price of oil began its collapse, and the vast social programs that oil paid for were now paid for by borrowing money and printing it, causing wild inflation. The economic flood is now made impossibly worse by what the rapporteur for Venezuela compared to medieval sieges. The Trump administration cut off Venezuela from the oil sale proceeds from its biggest customer, the USA. Everyone has been hurt economically, but the privileged class's bank accounts have become nearly worthless. So, knowing that the mestizo majority would not elect their great white hope Guaido, the angry white rich simply took to the streets, often armed. And yes, both sides are armed. I've seen this movie before. When I look at today's news reports of massive demonstrations against the so-called dictatorship of Venezuela's left government, it looks awfully like 2002, when I was first in Caracas reporting for BBC television. Then, the New York Times, NPR and other mainstream outlets in the U.S. reported on marches against the Chavez government, showing the tens of thousands of Venezuelans calling for Chavez's removal. But when I took my BBC camera crews to march with these protesters, they were clearly from the light-skinned minority. They were also the wealthy, and they wanted you to know it. Many of the women marched in high heels, the men peacocking in business suits, proudly displayed in the uniforms of their privileged class. The Chavistas wore patriotic yellow, blue and red t-shirts, sneaks, jeans. Race was an issue as much as political philosophy. When I marched alongside the opposition demonstrators, they shouted "Chavez, monkey," and worse. Many in the U.S. have never heard this story of race war in Venezuela, and war is what it is as the U.S. press does not recognize its own racial bias. In 2002, as today, the massive demonstrations of the wider Venezuelans were reported as evidence that Chavez was wildly unpopular. Yet, the day after each anti-Chavez march, I would witness and film the pro-Chavez demonstrations that flooded Caracas with an ocean of nearly 500,000 marchers, overwhelmingly poor mestizos, that received little or no coverage in the U.S. press. The bias continues. The New York Times did not run the photo of this past week's pro-Maduro demonstrations. But in hard-to-find photos and reports from my colleagues on the ground, the Chavista demonstrations are bigger, involving mass turnouts in several cities, not just wealthy neighborhoods in Caracas. Why do the poor march for Maduro? Even though the mestizo majority suffers today, they will not turn back to the pre-Chavez days of de facto apartheid. And we must remember this is not the first time the U.S. government has tried to overthrow the elected government in Venezuela. In 2002, George W. Bush's State Department chair led the coup. The plotters kidnapped Chavez and held him hostage. The coup was led by an oil industry leader and head of the Chamber of Commerce, Pedro Carmona, who had seized the nation's White House, and, like Guaido today, declared himself president. Carmona told me proudly about the fancy inaugural ball held by the nation's elite and attended by Bush's ambassador. But the Bush-Carmona coup collapsed when 1 million darker-skinned Venezuelans flooded the capital and forced the plotters to return their hero, the supposedly unpopular Chavez, to Miraflores, the presidential palace. President Carmona fled. Today, Guaido's supporters, like Carmona's, know they can't win an election given the overwhelming fact of the newly empowered mestizo majority. So Guaido has skipped the idea of an election altogether, simply replacing running for office with the recognition from Trump and allies which Guaido can't get from Venezuelans. When I see the images and hear the chants of the anti-Chavista demonstrators now, I'm also reminded of what I saw at a Trump rally in Macon, Georgia, this past November. The president slid out of Air Force One to tell the crowd, heavily weighted with white supremacists, that they needed to take back their country from those invading the border. Trump told them to fear gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, who is black, saying she would turn Georgia into Venezuela. I don't think Trump was talking about Abrams' program to bring universal health care to Georgia, as Chavez did for Venezuela. The U.S. press is quick to condemn the racial hatred on display at Trump rallies. But I have yet to hear or read in the U.S. press what our eyes can see in the 3 photos from Venezuela, an uprising of white people wanting to take back their country. And take note, the Venezuela push by the wealthy, internationally connected minority is operating by a regime change plan designed by neocon retread John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor. And take further note, It is a plan to control Venezuela and its oil, as Bolton proudly proclaims in the open. Ah, yes, the oil. It's always the oil. And Venezuela has plenty to seize, the world's largest reserves. We'll get to that in part II. Note: Greg Palast covered Venezuela during the Chavez presidency for BBC Television Newsnight and The Guardian. Download the film of Palast's BBC reports, The Assassination of Hugo Chavez, for free or with a donation to the Palast Investigative Fund. This article incorporates additional reporting by William Damatero in Caracas. Share this. Greg Palast. Greg Palast has written 4 New York Times bestsellers, including Armed Madhouse, Billionaires and